the chill of a November dawn, 1600, the winds swept through the grey stones of Dunfermline Palace in Scotland. Within those cold, echoing halls, a frail cry pierced the still air, the cry of a prince, born too early, too small, and too weak. His name was Charles Stuart, second son of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. Few believed he would survive the winter, yet that fragile child, wrapped in silks and trembling breath, would one day wear the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and lose them all upon a single block of wood. From the moment he entered the world, Charles's life was a struggle between expectation and fragility, between the divine weight of kingship and the human limits of the body. Unlike his elder brother Henry Frederick, who radiated health, charm, and charisma, young Charles was delicate, his legs weak, his speech delayed. He could barely stand until he was 3 years old, and his words came haltingly, as though the air itself resisted his voice. While Henry raced through palace corridors, Charles watched from afar, his world defined by shadows and silence. The court physicians fretted, priests prayed, and Queen Anne wept. To them, he was a fragile blessing, a reminder that divine favor was easily tested. He would be carried to bed by servants, his body wrapped in wool, his small hands clinging to rosary beads as the sound of prayers echoed from the chapel below. Yet within that frailty grew a quiet resolve, a stubbornness, perhaps even pride, to prove that he too was chosen by God. To understand Charles, one must first understand the brother he adored and envied. Prince Henry was everything a kingdom desired: bold, athletic, eloquent, a prince of promise. The people loved him, the court adored him. Even their father, King James VI and I, saw in Henry the reflection of an ideal monarch. Charles, meanwhile, was hidden behind tutors and silence. He learned early that affection was earned, not given. That kingship was not warmth, but endurance. When Henry took to the field on horseback, Charles was confined to his chamber, listening to the distant thunder of hooves, dreaming of strength he did not possess. He watched from the window, a boy longing for both admiration and escape. In 1612, tragedy struck. At just 18 years old, Prince Henry, the pride of the Stuarts, was struck by fever and died. The nation mourned, and so did Charles. But in that moment of grief, the impossible became real. The sickly, overlooked boy became heir to the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland. From the shadows of neglect, he stepped into a destiny forged by loss. Henry's death was both a door opening and a burden descending. For Charles, it was not triumph, but inheritance through sorrow. Overnight, the frail child was now a prince of expectation. Every glance from his father became heavier, every word from courtiers more measured. The eyes of the kingdom turned toward him, and he, shy and uncertain, could only bow beneath their gaze. Education became his refuge. Where Henry had strength, Charles had study. Under the guidance of tutors steeped in scripture and philosophy, he absorbed the language of theology, art, and governance. He found comfort in ritual and ceremony, in silence and order. To him, the divine right of kings was not mere theory, it was truth, sacred and immutable. In his solitude, he read deeply the scriptures, the classics, the teachings of divine authority. These words would shape not just his mind, but his soul. They whispered to him that kingship was not a gift of man, but the will of God, unchallengeable, unbroken, and eternal. It was a belief that would later harden into iron conviction and lead him, unknowingly, toward the scaffold. Queen Anne of Denmark, his mother, played her part in this shaping of faith and pride. A devout woman with a touch of mystery, her heart divided between Protestant conformity and Catholic fascination, she instilled in Charles a deep sense of religious ceremony. To her, worship was not merely prayer, it was art, beauty, reverence. The young prince grew to love the glitter of vestments, the fragrance of incense, the solemn rise of the organ. These early impressions would bloom into the high church aesthetics that defined his reign and alienated his Puritan subjects. In that blend of faith and formality, Charles found his identity, a man who saw the hand of God not only in Scripture, but in the majesty of kingship itself. His father, James I, was both scholar and king, brilliant yet paranoid, eloquent yet insecure. He lectured Charles endlessly on monarchy, theology, and the divine order of obedience. "A king," James declared, "is little God on earth." Charles listened, not with affection, but with absorption. The boy who once stammered began to speak with precision. The prince who once faltered in step now stood straight, poised, silent, a reflection of the power he believed ordained to him. But James's lessons came with a warning the son never heeded. A king who loses his people's hearts will soon lose his crown. By his late teens, Charles had grown into a man of refinement and restraint. His stammer faded, his body strengthened, and his demeanor became that of calm majesty. Yet beneath that poise lingered a nervous heart, a yearning for control in a world that had once pitied him. He admired art, architecture, and music, the instruments of beauty that gave shape to order. He patronized painters like Van Dyck, whose portraits would later immortalize him not as tyrant or martyr, but as a king of grace and sorrow. In those years, the foundations of his character were laid: piety, dignity, conviction, and silence. Each would serve him in rule and condemn him in rebellion. As he matured, Charles found himself increasingly isolated from both father and court. James's favorites dominated attention, especially George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, a man who would become both Charles's closest companion and the spark of future catastrophe. Together, they would dream of glory and plunge England into division. But for now, Charles remained the obedient son, the quiet prince, waiting, learning, brooding. Every corridor of the palace whispered to him of destiny. Every sermon reminded him that kings rule by God's will, not by Parliament's grace. And so, beneath his still surface, the belief took root that to question the king was to question God himself. By the year 1625, Charles had become king, young, reserved, untested. The frail child of Dunfermline now sat upon the throne of 3 kingdoms. His father's words still echoed in his mind, his mother's faith in his heart. But outside the palace walls, the winds of change were rising. The people had changed. The world had changed, and the divine right he cherished was already fading like candlelight in the storm. The story of Charles Stuart, the king who would lose his head, begins not in arrogance or ambition, but in frailty, faith, and the shadow of love lost too soon. London, 1603. The old Tudor sun has set. The Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I, lies in silence at Westminster, and across the northern border a new dawn breaks, uncertain, trembling, wrapped in mist. Into England rides King James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, the first monarch to wear both crowns. 2 nations divided by centuries of suspicion are suddenly joined, not by sword or treaty, but by the fragile thread of blood. As the procession winds through the capital, Londoners line the streets, eager and wary. They cheer the promise of unity, but behind every cheer lingers a question. Who is this northern king who speaks with the tongue of a scholar and the heart of a preacher? In Whitehall Palace, under ceilings painted with angels and saints, a new dynasty begins. The banners of the House of Stuart rise, crimson and gold, fierce with lions and unicorns, proclaiming peace where there has never been peace, and union where there has only been rivalry. And within that new house, a quiet child watches, unseen by the world. Prince Charles, the king's second son, frail in body, yet burning with a strange, inward fire. James is unlike any monarch England has ever known. He is not the image of Elizabeth's golden majesty, nor the thunder of Henry's rule. He is a man of words, vast rivers of them, flowing from lips that never seem to tire. He debates with bishops, mocks theologians, writes treatises on kingship and witchcraft, speaks to courtiers as though he were delivering sermons. His faith in his own reason is boundless. His belief in his divine right to govern is absolute. A king, he writes, is God's lieutenant upon earth. He makes and unmakes his subjects. He judges and is not judged. These are not the musings of a philosopher. They are blueprints for a monarchy sanctified by heaven itself. For James, kingship is not merely rule, it is sacrament. The throne is an altar, and the crown a halo. While courtiers feast and flatter, Charles moves quietly through the edges of the royal household. He is delicate, shy, a child haunted by illness. His tongue stammers, his limbs weaken, even his gait seems uncertain. Yet the frailty that others pity becomes his crucible. Alone in his chambers, he listens through the walls to his father's endless debates, theology, politics, the philosophy of kingship. He watches how words command obedience, how the mere idea of divine authority bends men's will. In that silence, the prince begins to understand power, not as noise, but as presence, not as the clang of steel, but as the quiet certainty of belief. Night after night, the king summons his son. Together they sit before the hearth, the father dictating, the child listening. James speaks of sovereignty, of order, of the sacred duty of rulers. A king, he intones, is the head of the body politic. His command gives it life, his wisdom, direction, his virtue, salvation. Charles nods, his eyes fixed not on the flame, but on the reflection of the crown that gleams above the mantle. To James, these are lessons. To Charles, they are revelations. Where James's belief is intellectual, an argument crafted by reason, Charles's belief becomes devotional, almost mystical. The monarchy, to him, is not a human contract, but a divine covenant. He begins to see his father's doctrines not as royal philosophy, but as scripture, written for him alone. The pages of the king's book, Basilicon Doron, become his private gospel. Fear God, it commands, and honor your king. The words echo through the corridors of Charles's mind until they fuse with his very soul. And so, a dangerous inheritance takes root, a faith so pure, so unwavering, that it will one day prove unable to bend before the tempests of rebellion. The crowns James wears are heavy with contradiction. Scotland and England, two realms bound together, yet each despising the other's ways. The king dreams of harmony, of a single nation beneath one scepter. But his dream is mocked by nobles and ministers alike. At court, Scots and Englishmen whisper against one another, accusing, plotting, conspiring. The unity James proclaims from the pulpit dissolves in the antechamber's smoke. Charles grows amid this dissonance. To him, the world seems fractured, loyalty a shifting tide, politics a theater of masks. Only in the idea of kingship does he find constancy. If men cannot be trusted, perhaps God can. If the court is false, perhaps the crown is true. In this confusion of courts and kingdoms, the prince retreats into conviction, forging within himself a vision of monarchy untouched by the corruption of men. The father's teachings and the son's devotion begin to intertwine, fusing intellect with faith, doctrine with destiny. What was meant as caution becomes creed. What was philosophy becomes prophecy. By the flicker of firelight, James believes he is shaping a wise and disciplined heir. He does not see that he is kindling a fire that cannot be quenched. The boy who sits silently at his side will one day rule as though heaven itself ordained his every act. And when that faith is tested, when his people cry out against him, he will look not to Parliament or to council, but to the sky, and find there only silence. In that moment, the inheritance of a vision is complete, a theology of kingship born in love, forged in intellect, and destined to end in blood. Thus begins the tragedy of Charles I, the prince who mistook conviction for grace and obedience for destiny. Whitehall Palace, London. It stands as both a palace and a stage, a monument to the glittering illusion of power. Within its halls, faith and politics entwine like vines around stone, beautiful yet strangling. For James I, this court is his creation, a living reflection of his mind, full of intellect, excess, argument, and charm. It is a world of sermons and masks, of theology debated beside jesters' riddles, and flattery masquerading as loyalty. To the outside world, the Stuart court is dazzling. To those who dwell within it, it is a maze, one that feeds ambition and devours the innocent. The court of James I glitters under torchlight, gold leaf on the walls, perfume in the air, words sharper than any blade. Here, wisdom and deceit share the same table. Bishops dine beside poets. Courtiers whisper beneath tapestries depicting saints. At the king's command, playwrights and philosophers perform their brilliance like jesters before Olympus. To please James is to survive. To bore him is to vanish. His moods shift like the wind, from laughter to fury, from reason to wrath, and the courtiers dance accordingly. For the young Charles Stuart, it is an alien world. He is quiet where others shout, devout where others jest, disciplined where others indulge. In a court ruled by charm and rhetoric, silence becomes his armor. He studies faces instead of books, and learns that every bow conceals intent. A smile can mean alliance or betrayal. A whispered prayer can be both devotion and weapon. In this glittering theater, Charles learns the first cruel lesson of kingship. Power does not speak, it listens. From this world of masks rises one figure brighter than the rest, George Villiers, later to become the Duke of Buckingham. He enters the king's orbit like a comet, dazzling, confident, impossibly handsome. A man of humble birth who ascends not through blood, but through presence. In James's eyes, Villiers is everything a monarch's companion should be: witty, loyal, elegant, and utterly devoted. To many courtiers, he is a scandal, an upstart, the embodiment of favoritism's corruption. Yet to James, he is indispensable. The two become inseparable, their bond blurring the lines between friendship, affection, and influence. Every petition, every appointment, every royal decision now flows through Villiers' hand. To the young Charles, watching from the shadows, this is both a revelation and a wound. The father's affection he longed for has found another heir, not of blood, but of charisma. At first, Charles despises Buckingham. The favorite's laughter offends his reverence. His easy confidence mocks the prince's restraint. Yet over time, that resentment transforms. Buckingham, sensing opportunity, turns his charm toward the prince. He becomes a tutor in worldly things, a guide to court politics, diplomacy, and the art of command. And Charles, starved of closeness, lets the man step into the void his father never filled. It is a bond born of loneliness, forged in admiration, sealed in faith, and destined, one day, to bring ruin. Through Buckingham's rise, Charles glimpses the hidden machinery of monarchy. The court, he learns, is not ruled by law or even by loyalty, but by access. Whoever stands nearest the throne shapes the world beyond it. Ministers and bishops queue for the favorite's ear. Gifts flow like rivers, gold, estates, promises of obedience. And through it all, James sits enthroned in weary majesty, convinced that divine wisdom guides his every decree. The young prince watches, listens, absorbs. He does not yet know that this structure, this web of favor and intrigue, will one day become his inheritance. And like his father, he will be both its master and its victim. The Stuart court loves spectacle. Masks, elaborate theatrical performances of myth and virtue, become royal sermons in motion. Gods and angels descend on painted clouds. Courtiers dressed as virtues parade beneath chandeliers. Each pageant is a mirror held to the monarchy, reflecting it as divine and eternal. Charles, though shy, is moved by this theater. The pageantry speaks to his sense of destiny, the image of the king as chosen by heaven, reigning by sacred right. It is beauty turned into theology. To him, the mask is not mere entertainment. It is a promise, a vision of a world where the king's will and God's will are one, a world without discord, where every subject knows their place beneath the crown. But outside the palace walls, reality grows restless. England's nobles grumble at taxation. Parliament questions royal authority. And the people who once adored the Tudors begin to murmur that their new king listens more to God than to them. The seeds of rebellion are sown in whispers, but in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall, no one hears them. Charles and Buckingham's friendship deepens through shared devotion and ambition. Together, they attend sermons extolling divine right. Together, they kneel beneath painted ceilings that proclaim kingship as sacred. To Charles, Buckingham becomes not merely a friend, but a fellow believer. In this companionship, he finds both comfort and confirmation. If God has placed the king above all men, then surely those who serve him share in that holiness. Buckingham's loyalty feels ordained, but the court whispers otherwise. To them, the favorite's rise is arrogance, his influence, corruption. Ministers sneer in private, nobles rage in silence, yet all bow in public. Charles, who cannot bear disloyalty, interprets their resentment as sin. Every murmur against Buckingham becomes to him a murmur against divine order itself. In defending his friend, he learns to defend his own authority and begins to equate love with obedience, criticism with blasphemy. The years pass. The prince matures in faith, in restraint, and in a growing sense of purpose. But around him, the court decays. The laughter grows louder, the gold dulls, the debts deepen. James grows old and weary, his mind clouded, his grip on rule weakening. Into the gap steps Buckingham, and behind him, Charles. The prince no longer hides in shadow. He begins to speak, to command, to plan. His voice is gentle, but resolute. He believes, with the full fire of his father's teachings, that monarchy is not politics, it is calling. And the crown, soon to rest upon his brow, is not merely power, it is a divine trust. But the world beyond Whitehall no longer shares that faith. England has changed. The Reformation has cracked old certainties. The Puritans demand freedom of conscience. Parliament seeks a voice in rule. Merchants want profit over piety. The age of absolute kingship is dying, and Charles, shaped by its ideals, is about to ascend into its ruins. In the dim light of the great hall, the aging James sits slumped upon his throne. Beside him stands Buckingham, the ever-present favorite, and just beyond the shadows waits Charles, silent, pale, and unyielding. In that tableau lies the passing of an era. The scholar king, whose faith made words into crowns, the favorite, whose charm made influence into empire, and the prince, whose belief will turn both into tragedy. The court of James I will soon fade into memory, its music silenced, its splendor tarnished. But its lessons will burn in the heart of the son who inherits it. Thus, the world of court and power becomes the crucible of conviction, a fragile faith gilded in ceremony, and a lonely prince preparing to wear the most dangerous crown in England. In the fading years of King James's reign, when the weight of wisdom pressed against the decline of the flesh, the monarch turned inward, not toward prayer, but toward pen and paper. For in words, he sought immortality, and in one boy, quiet, observant, fragile, he sought the continuation of his own divine vision. Charles Stuart, the second son, the child who was never meant to rule, and yet would inherit the very doctrine that would destroy him. King James was a man of contradictions and conviction, a philosopher king with a mind sharpened by scripture and paranoia alike. He believed himself God's anointed, ordained by heaven, guided by divine will, and unanswerable to mortal men. But beneath the rhetoric of sacred kingship lay an old fear. That authority, no matter how sanctified, could be undone by rebellion. He had fled such fears in Scotland. He had seen them linger in England. And now, as the throne creaked under the strain of a divided kingdom, James resolved that his son would never face such doubt. He would shape Charles into a monarch unbreakable, a king of divine purpose and unyielding order. The king is the head of the body politic. If the head be cut off, the body cannot live. These were not idle words. They were scripture wrapped in warning, prophecy disguised as instruction. The father believed that rebellion against the monarch was rebellion against God himself, that the crown was not worn by choice, but by divine appointment. And in those late-night lessons, as candles burned low and shadows crept along the chamber walls, Charles listened, small, solemn, devout, and believed every word. Charles's education was unlike that of other princes. There were no tournaments, no hunts, no games of politics to harden his will. Instead, there was doctrine, discipline, devotion. Tutors recited verses from Scripture. Clergymen lectured on obedience and divine order. Every lesson was a hymn to hierarchy, the perfect harmony of king above subject, heaven above earth. Yet, in that symmetry lay a fatal flaw. Charles learned not how to bend, but only how to stand. Not how to listen, but only how to command. James, for all his brilliance, was a man haunted by rebellion's ghost. He had faced conspiracies, the gunpowder plot, whispers from Parliament, Catholic dissenters in the shadows. And so he ruled through fear, wrapped in velvet and incense. He believed that love could never secure a crown, only authority could. And so he taught his son to rule not with the heart, but with the scepter. not with mercy, but with divine certainty. But where James's mind could balance cunning with command, Charles's soul knew only faith. He would inherit his father's conviction, without his father's compromise. In time, the lessons became doctrine, and the doctrine became identity. Charles prayed in solitude, knelt before altars not just as a man of faith, but as a vessel of divine purpose. He began to believe, truly, deeply, that he was chosen, that his authority was not to be shared or questioned, but preserved, unbroken, sanctified by God. The court around him, decadent and divided, saw only the gentleness of a prince. But within that gentleness was iron, a quiet, unyielding conviction. A belief that the crown was not merely an ornament of power, but the very embodiment of heaven's will on earth. And as James aged, his health failing, the shadow of succession fell heavy upon the kingdom. The father looked to the son and saw a mirror, fragile yet firm, reflective yet resolved. He took pride in Charles's piety, but he mistook stillness for strength. He saw obedience as wisdom, silence as maturity. He never realized that the same lessons meant to fortify the crown would one day lead his son to defy an entire nation in the name of God. Remember, my son, the king is the head, and the body cannot live without the head. Those words would live within Charles's heart, like a sacred vow. And when the time came, when Parliament rose in fury, when armies gathered, when judgment fell, it would be that lesson, planted in innocence, that would guide his hand and seal his fate. In the quiet chambers of his youth, Charles learned what it meant to be a king, but not what it meant to be a man, and from that silence, history's loudest tragedy was born. Religion was not merely the air Charles breathed. It was the rhythm of his heart, the pulse of his soul, and the architecture of his mind. In an England divided between faiths, torn between scripture and sovereignty, he grew not amid war or rebellion, but in cathedrals of shadow and light. He was born into a kingdom forever haunted by its own conscience. The Reformation had left its scars on every wall, its echoes in every prayer. England called itself Protestant, yet its soul, deep down, longed for the incense and ceremony it had cast aside. Catholic fears lingered like ghosts. Puritan fire burned like judgment, and between them stood a prince, small, solemn, and devout, who found peace not in words, but in worship. It was his mother, Queen Anne of Denmark, who first opened the doors of faith to him, not through theology, but through beauty. She taught him that divinity could be seen, not just spoken, that the glory of God could dwell within a painting, a hymn, a carved beam of oak lit by sunlight through stained glass. Where his father's sermons thundered with reason and fear, Anne's faith whispered with stillness and grace. She believed that the soul could rise toward heaven through art, through harmony, through order. To her, the sacred was not an argument, it was an atmosphere. And Charles listened. He absorbed that faith not as doctrine, but as music. Every candle that flickered, every choir that rose in unison, became part of his theology. For him, God was not thunder, but silence, not chaos, but harmony. And in that harmony, he began to glimpse his destiny. In those early years, the young prince attended Mass with almost monastic devotion. He stood beneath vaulted ceilings and let the sound of psalms wash over him like waves. He marveled at the symmetry of architecture. Each arch, each beam, each shaft of light designed to lift the eye and the soul upward. The church was not just a place of prayer. It was the visible order of heaven upon the earth, a realm where all things had purpose, where every rank and ritual formed part of a divine design. It was here, within this temple of symmetry, that Charles began to shape his belief in monarchy as a reflection of heaven itself. Just as angels obeyed God in perfect order, so too must subjects obey their king. The altar and the throne, he believed, were mirrors of the same sacred truth. To question one was to profane the other. This belief did not come from pride. It came from awe, from the stillness that filled him when he stood in sacred spaces. He saw the beauty of God as structure, not passion, as order, not debate, as light that fell in measured harmony across stone. The Puritans saw corruption in ceremony. Charles saw divinity. The Puritans tore down altars. Charles rebuilt them. Each act of reverence became, in time, an act of defiance. He did not understand rebellion as politics. He understood it as blasphemy, a challenge not to his person, but to the will of heaven itself. It was here, in the half-light of faith and fear, that his world began to take form. His father's teachings had made him believe in divine order. His mother's grace made him love its beauty. Together, they built a theology that would define his reign and doom it. For Charles's vision of kingship was not forged in politics, but in prayer. He did not see his crown as an inheritance, but as a covenant between God and man, written not in blood, but in light. And yet, even light casts shadows. As he grew older, those shadows began to take shape in the figures who surrounded him. Ambitious courtiers, suspicious bishops, and theologians eager to guide the conscience of a prince. Among them, one would rise above the rest. William Laud, a man whose devotion to ceremony matched Charles's own. Laud would give structure to Charles's faith, and in doing so, sharpen the edge of his destiny. But before that, in these tender, formative years, Charles's faith was still pure, almost innocent. He believed that beauty could heal division, that harmony could silence rebellion, that worship could bind a nation torn apart by its own soul. He could not see that in England, religion was no longer sanctuary, but spark. In the flicker of candles and the murmur of psalms, a vision took root in his heart, a vision of sacred kingship, serene and absolute. He did not yet know that this same faith, born in peace and beauty, would one day lead him to the scaffold. But for now, he was simply a boy in prayer, eyes closed, lips moving softly in the light of a single flame, believing that heaven watched and approved. Thus was born the faith of Charles I, the faith that would crown him and destroy him. They said the young Charles Stuart was a child of whispers, a boy who spoke rarely, but listened to everything. In the echoing halls of Stirling and later at the English court, silence became his armor. Every pause, every lowered gaze, every careful word was a defense, not of arrogance, but of vulnerability. Where other princes shouted their desires, Charles carried his inwardly, folding them like parchment beneath the weight of duty. His speech was precise, his manners meticulous, his every gesture measured to conceal the tremor of uncertainty beneath. Those who met him briefly found him distant, too controlled, too composed. But those few who earned his trust saw something different. A gentle man yearning for order in a world of noise. He loved music, not the boisterous songs of taverns, but the delicate harmonies of viols and voices blending into sacred calm. He painted. He read scripture. He sought meaning in beauty and structure, things he could understand, shape, and hold. For Charles, beauty was a refuge from chaos. faith a language that spoke when words failed him. Yet silence in court is a dangerous gift. In the storm of ambition, where words buy loyalty and wit wins survival, Charles's quiet restraint was mistaken for disdain. Courtiers, bred on flattery and intrigue, saw in him not humility, but hauteur, not contemplation, but coldness. To them, he was not the fragile boy who had once stammered before his tutors, but a proud prince who looked down from a height no one could reach. And so, the wall he built for safety became his prison. That same silence, once a shield, hardened over time into conviction. When Charles spoke of kingship, he did so not as a politician but as a believer. His authority, he thought, came from God, a sacred charge, not a contract with men. And so silence transformed into obstinacy, reflection into refusal. When Parliament shouted, Charles prayed. When they demanded compromise, he withdrew into stillness, convinced that to yield was to sin. In his heart, the quiet faith of the prince merged with the divine certainty of the king, and in that merging lay his destiny. The world would remember him as proud, detached, unbending. But beneath the mask of marble stillness, there once lived a man afraid to be misunderstood, a prince who believed silence could preserve dignity, and in the end, a king who learned that silence could also lead him to ruin. The door shuts softly. The prince is alone again. His silence, once his only defense, now fills the entire palace. In the twilight years of King James's reign, the royal court was a theater of intellect and intrigue. The air hung heavy with debate. Sermons and philosophy, poetry and politics, wit sharpened into weaponry. And in the corner of those grand, echoing chambers stood a young man who spoke little but watched everything, Charles Stuart, the prince who carried the solemnity of silence like a cloak. He was his father's reflection, but not his father's echo. Where James's words danced, Charles's were carved. Where James sought to charm, Charles sought to command. The father ruled through persuasion, the son would learn to rule through will. To understand Charles, one must first understand the ghost who shaped him. King James VI and the First was a man of contradictions, brilliant and insecure, pious yet pragmatic, a scholar who believed himself chosen by God, yet haunted by the fragility of kingship. He had united crowns, but not hearts. His court was a nest of rival factions, his reign a balancing act between faith and reason, crown and parliament, peace and pride. Charles absorbed it all. He studied his father's triumphs, but he also memorized his failures. He saw a king mocked for his accent, doubted for his learning, mistrusted for his politics. And so the son swore never to be doubted, never to yield, never to be seen as weak. Yet James loved his son fiercely, though he understood him less and less. He listens too much, the king once confided to a courtier, a dangerous habit in a prince. The old king believed in conversation as the art of kingship. He saw in debate the divine measure of mind. But Charles saw in it only corruption, words twisted by politics, loyalty traded for applause. In his father's endless discourse, Charles perceived not majesty, but erosion. A king, he thought, should not argue his power. He should embody it. Their relationship became a kind of ritual, father and son bound together by affection, but divided by vision. In council chambers, James spoke of compromise. Charles watched in silence, his jaw tight. In private, James urged flexibility. Charles replied only with reverent obedience, the kind that conceals quiet defiance. The rift between them was polite, invisible, Yet it grew with every passing season, like frost spreading across a window pane. To the courtiers, it was imperceptible. To history, it would be fatal. In the winter of 1624, James's health began to fail. The king, once lively and quick-witted, grew pale and weary. He watched from his chambers as the young prince took on more duties: audiences with ambassadors, oversight of court ceremonies, discussions of faith. And in Charles, he saw something both reassuring and terrifying: the ghost of himself, stripped of warmth and multiplied in conviction. "He will rule better than I," James murmured one night to his confidant, "or die for trying." It was not prophecy, it was recognition. For James, who had spent a lifetime balancing words against swords, saw in his son a future where there would be no balance at all. The old king's dreams had been of unity: one faith, one throne, one peace. But his vision had been stitched with compromise, and compromise was not a word Charles could bear. Charles believed not in negotiation, but in divine order. To him, monarchy was not a contract, but a covenant. To rule was not to bargain, but to obey the will of heaven. And in that belief, Charles became not just his father's heir, but his mirror, his shadow, and his undoing. When James finally passed in March of 1625, Charles stood at his father's bedside, silent as ever. The courtiers wept, the priests prayed, but the young king did not. His father had left him a divided kingdom, a restless parliament, and a fragile peace, but also the unshakable belief that kings ruled by divine right. In the flickering candlelight of that death chamber, Charles's eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. The mirror had outlived the image, and history, watching through the glass, began to tremble. Thus ended the reign of James, and began the long descent of Charles, the king who mistook faith for destiny and destiny for command. In the twilight of King James's reign, when the corridors of Whitehall grew heavy with the scent of sickness and incense, another figure rose quietly beside the young prince. Graceful, charismatic, and dangerous. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. To the courtiers, he was a spectacle, the sun around which all lesser stars revolved. Handsome, eloquent, bold beyond reason, Buckingham had mastered the game of charm that Charles had never learned to play. Where Charles hesitated, Buckingham leapt. Where Charles prayed, Buckingham persuaded. And together, they became something greater and far more perilous than either man alone. The friendship began in the waning years of the old king's life. Buckingham, already the favorite of James, turned his glittering gaze upon the prince. He saw in Charles what he lacked: depth, restraint, a quiet purity that made others uneasy. And Charles saw in Buckingham what he feared he could never be: confident, articulate, adored. To the lonely prince, raised in silence and ceremony, Buckingham was a revelation, the embodiment of action, of movement, of living ambition. He spoke the words Charles could not say. He carried the energy Charles could not show. The two men, opposites in every instinct, formed a bond that would reshape the English crown. When James's health began to fail, the court grew restless. Ambassadors whispered of succession. Nobles calculated futures like chess masters. But Buckingham, ever perceptive, moved faster than all. He positioned himself at the center of every decision, every alliance, every private meeting between father and son. He ensured that when the old king's light dimmed, the new one would rise with Buckingham already beside him, not as counselor, but as partner. He called it loyalty. Others called it strategy. To Charles, it was salvation. In the final days of King James's life, the sick room at Theobald's palace was heavy with incense and whispered prayers. Buckingham hovered like a spectre, attending, advising, orchestrating. He decided who entered and who did not, what news was delivered and what was delayed. And always, the prince was near, silent, watchful, learning that power was not merely inherited, but managed. One evening, as the king drifted into feverish sleep, Charles turned to Buckingham and said softly, "We must preserve him." The Duke bowed. "We will preserve everything, Your Highness." But he did not mean the king's life. He meant his own place beside the throne that would soon be empty. When the old king died in March 1625, the world shifted. The man who had ruled 2 realms with words was gone. In his place stood a new monarch, silent, devout, and certain of divine favor, and at his right hand, the glittering architect of his confidence, the Duke of Buckingham. Together, they envisioned a purified monarchy, one restored to holiness and absolute order. Together, they would march into war, into scandal, and ultimately into ruin. For Charles, Buckingham became more than a favorite. He became the embodiment of action sanctified by purpose. He led armies, negotiated marriages, commanded fleets. He whispered in the king's ear during prayers and advised him on the will of God. The court saw them as inseparable, a monarch of divine conviction and his minister of earthly ambition. But beneath that partnership pulsed an imbalance neither could control. Buckingham's hunger for glory, his reckless extravagance and failed expeditions, began to stain the throne itself. And Charles, loyal beyond reason, defended him against every accusation, every outrage, every rebellion of Parliament. Each defense, each indulgence, drew Charles further from his people, deeper into isolation, deeper into belief that he and his chosen few alone were guided by heaven. Treason, they cried, corruption. But Charles saw none of it. To him, Buckingham was not corrupt. He was chosen. In defending the Duke, Charles was defending divine will itself. "If I lose him," he once said privately, "I lose myself." And when Buckingham was assassinated in 1628, struck down by a disgruntled soldier in Portsmouth, the king's composure shattered for the first and only time. Witnesses said that Charles locked himself in his chamber and wept without sound for hours. Others claimed he refused to speak for days. For a man built from silence, that grief was unbearable. With Buckingham's death, Charles lost more than a friend. He lost the last bridge between his soul and the world. The courtiers whispered that the king had buried not just a man, but his own humanity. From that day forward, Charles's belief in his divine mission hardened into something absolute, unbending, untouchable, and in the end, fatal. The voice that once guided him was gone, and in its place, only the silence of God remained. The scholar king was gone. The divine monarch was born. And with him began the long and sorrowful march toward a crown that would one day roll in the dust. On the morning of March 27th, 1625, the bells of London tolled for both an ending and a beginning. The old king, James VI and I, had breathed his last, and in that single breath, the burden of 3 crowns fell upon his son, Charles Stuart, now King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He was not like his father. Where James had ruled through words, verbose, scholarly, and political, Charles ruled through silence. He spoke less, but believed more. For in the quiet of his heart burned a conviction that no parliament could sway, no rebellion could erase, that his authority came not from men, but from God himself. In his private chambers, Charles would write of kingship as a sacred trust. Princes, he believed, are accountable to none but heaven. It was not arrogance, at least not in his mind. It was faith. He had inherited from his father the doctrine of the divine right of kings, but where James had wielded it as argument, Charles wore it as armor. And beneath that armor, a man of gentleness and fragility, shy, pious, and inwardly torn, began to disappear. His coronation was unlike any before it. The plague ravaged London, forcing the ceremony to be delayed and diminished. Gone was the usual spectacle of pageantry. No cheering crowds, no lavish feasts. Instead, a subdued gathering within Westminster Abbey, where candlelight shimmered on golden relics and whispered prayers filled the air. As the Archbishop lowered the crown upon his bowed head, Charles's lips barely moved. He prayed not for glory nor victory, but for strength to serve God's will. Yet already, a subtle storm gathered beyond the abbey walls. His people did not know this quiet young king. They saw not the tenderness that guided his private thoughts, but the distance that cloaked his public image. He rarely smiled. He spoke softly, as though the world itself were too loud. To his subjects, he was unknowable, a monarch who ruled not through persuasion, but through conviction. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in waiting. But to Charles, his silence was not weakness, it was devotion. In that silence, he believed he could hear the voice of God, and from that divine whisper came a deadly certainty. That kingship was holy, and to question it was sin. This belief would define his reign and destroy it. For with every decision, Charles sought not to please men, but to serve heaven. He saw his duties as sacred vows, to guard the church, preserve order, and protect divine truth, even at the cost of peace. But kings who speak with God seldom listen to men. Parliament demanded counsel, Charles offered command. His people sought understanding, he gave them silence. In time, that silence became a wall, and behind it, a crown began to weigh heavier than any sword. The courtiers whispered that their new king prayed too much, spoke too little, and trusted too few. His devotion was genuine, but so was his isolation. He found solace only in two things: his faith and his queen, Henrietta Maria of France, a devout Catholic whose presence deepened the suspicion of his Protestant subjects. To them, she was the serpent in Eden. To him, she was grace incarnate. In her, he found love, but in loving her, he lost his people. And so the crown, symbol of divine favor, became a silent, shining cage. The more he prayed, the more alone he became. The more he trusted heaven, the further he drifted from earth. In that silence, history took shape. A king convinced of divine purpose, a parliament rising in defiance, a nation whispering rebellion. All the while Charles knelt in prayer, believing that obedience to God would one day redeem the crown. But heaven's silence can be the loudest judgment of all. The son who once lived in his father's shadow would one day lose his head beneath it. And in that quiet moment when the blade fell, the kingdom would remember that it all began here, in silence, beneath the weight of a divine crown. The year was 1625, the twilight of an age and the birth of another. Across the cold halls of Theobald's palace, silence reigned where once the voice of a king had echoed. King James VI and the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, was dead. For more than 2 decades, James had styled himself Rex Pacificus, the bringer of peace. He had woven theology and kingship together like threads of divine silk, believing that reason, faith, and authority could coexist beneath the same crown. He dreamed of unity between nations, between churches, between heaven and earth itself. But his reign, though learned and luminous, had been one of compromise. He was loved and loathed in equal measure, a scholar on the throne, a philosopher in a warrior's chair. And now, with his death, that fragile equilibrium began to crumble. In the stillness of morning, a young prince stood apart from the gathered courtiers. Charles Stuart, the second son, a boy once frail, stammering, and uncertain, now found himself heir to two kingdoms and a legacy he could never escape. Where his father's voice had filled rooms with argument and laughter, Charles's own words were few, measured, and heavy with restraint. He was a man of inner depth, of delicate conscience, of private prayers whispered behind closed doors. But in the theater of kingship, silence can be mistaken for weakness. His father, James, had often looked upon him with concern. He had seen in Charles a mirror that reflected none of his own brilliance, no quick wit, no gift for charm or persuasion. Instead, Charles possessed something else, a quiet gravity, a sense of purpose drawn from faith rather than politics. To James, this was both admirable and dangerous, for he knew that a king who believes himself too righteous may one day mistake his conviction for divine command. Charles had grown up not amid the laughter of his father's court, but in loneliness. His elder brother, Henry Frederick, had been the golden child, bold, athletic, beloved by the people. When Henry died young, all the hope of a dynasty shifted onto Charles's narrow shoulders. The prince who once limped and stuttered was forced into the light. He learned to mask insecurity with ceremony and fear with faith. He turned to art, to architecture, to prayer, to things he could control when the world beyond his chamber seemed uncertain. In paintings, he saw order. In scripture, he found purpose. And in the doctrine of divine right, he discovered what he believed was truth, that kings are not chosen by men, but by God, and therefore answer to no earthly power. It was an idea his father had flirted with, but in Charles, it became religion. The courtiers whispered as the coronation drew near. They remembered the late king's words, "Kings are little gods upon earth." They saw in the young prince the same belief, but none of the charm to soften it. In that belief lay both destiny and doom. For Charles did not see a crown as a gift, but as a burden, holy and immovable. He would not bend to Parliament. He would not yield to dissent. He would rule as his conscience dictated, by the grace of God. But grace is a fragile light, and power a dangerous flame. And so, beneath the vaults of Westminster, as the crown of his father was lowered onto his head, Charles Stuart became not merely king, but the embodiment of divine silence in a world that demanded speech. He stepped from his father's shadow, but in truth, the shadow followed. The reign of Charles I had begun, not with thunder nor triumph, but with quiet conviction. A conviction that would lead him, step by step, from sacred coronation to blood-stained scaffold. The son had inherited not just a throne, but the echo of his father's ghosts. Dawn rises over Westminster, cloaked not in celebration, but in silence. London, the beating heart of the realm, lies weary and fearful. The plague still lingers in its narrow streets, and the scent of death has become as familiar as the toll of prayer. The streets that once echoed with cheers for new monarchs now lie hushed, the crowds thinned by fear and fatigue. In that pale morning, Charles Stuart steps into history. He is but 25 years old, a man of quiet voice, delicate frame, and a gaze that hides both conviction and fragility. Yet he walks as though guided by invisible hands, by a belief that heaven itself has chosen him, that he is not merely a king, but the vessel of God's will on earth. Inside Westminster Abbey, the air is heavy with incense and dread. Black draperies hang from high columns, remnants of mourning for his father, James I. The great chandeliers flicker in the haze, gold trembling in the candlelight, as though reluctant to shine. The ceremony begins. The Archbishop of Canterbury, robed in white and gold, moves toward the high altar. The organ groans like thunder beneath the vaulted ceiling. Every sound magnified, every breath sacred. Charles kneels before the altar, head bowed. His eyes are closed, not in humility, but in utter devotion. The Archbishop's voice trembles through the Abbey's vastness, invoking the blessing of God, angels, and saints. The crown, St. Edward's crown, glitters upon the velvet cushion. It is more than gold. It is destiny made tangible. When it is placed upon his head, Charles does not look up. He whispers instead a prayer none can hear. I serve not men, but the Almighty. Yet outside the Abbey walls, the world stirs differently. The people of London, once eager for royal pageantry, now watch from a distance. Many cannot enter the church. The plague keeps them away. Some whisper that the ceremony is cursed. Others that Charles is too proud, too pious, too distant from his people. The Queen-to-be, Henrietta Maria of France, is not present. She remains a Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, a symbol of division before the marriage even begins. Even in the moment meant to unite a nation, Charles stands alone. As the service ends, the new king walks slowly through the nave. His footsteps echo across the stone, merging with the fading hymn. The crown weighs heavily on his head, not from its gold, but from its meaning. The coronation oil, freshly anointed, gleams faintly on his forehead. The smell of myrrh, frankincense, and old stone fills his senses. For a moment, he imagines his father's ghost watching from the shadows, James I, the philosopher king, the dreamer of divine monarchy. And in that silence, Charles makes a vow that will define his life and destroy his reign, to rule not by Parliament's will, but by God's alone. But the Abbey grows colder as he departs. The golden procession he expected never comes. The streets of London offer only the thin applause of a few loyal subjects and the curious stares of many more. The king's carriage rolls through fog and the echo of bells. The crowds bow, but their silence speaks louder than words. The divine light he believes in has not yet reached their eyes. What is a king, if not God's chosen steward? And what is rebellion, if not sin disguised as reason? Thus begins a reign born not of compromise, but of conviction, radiant, unwavering, and doomed. For Charles's faith is not in men, nor in counsel, but in the celestial order he believes crowns him with purpose. To question him is to question heaven. To oppose him is to defy the will of God. Yet power without balance is not divinity. It is destiny untempered, belief unbound. And as the last notes of the coronation hymn fade into silence, the seeds of civil war are already sown in the marble cracks beneath his feet. The coronation of Charles I was not merely the rise of a king. It was the beginning of a spiritual war, one between conscience and crown, between earth and heaven. A coronation of shadows, lit only by the fragile light of faith, and the whisper of fate that one day the hand of man would take the head of God's anointed. The year is 1625. England's new king, Charles Stuart, still wears the scent of anointing oil upon his brow. The echo of his coronation hymns has barely faded when the next great chapter of his life begins. Not in Westminster, but across the Channel. From the glittering courts of France comes a bride, Henrietta Maria, daughter of Henry IV and sister to Louis XIII. She is 16, young, radiant, and fiercely Catholic in a kingdom that has burned for its faith more than once. To Charles, she is grace incarnate, a princess of beauty and devotion. To England, she is a storm waiting to break. Her ship cuts through the gray waters of the Channel like a vision from another world, silken banners of gold and white snapping against the wind, the crucifix gleaming at her bow. In her cabin, Henrietta Maria prays, fingers tracing her rosary, lips murmuring the Latin words of the Angelus. She prays not for conquest, but for understanding. Yet already, England's preachers thunder against her name. The fear is older than she is. The ghost of Mary Tudor, of Bloody Mary and the Spanish fires that once consumed the faithful and the heretic alike. For the English, a Catholic queen is not merely a foreigner. She is memory resurrected. When Henrietta Maria arrives at Dover, the day is gray and damp. The sea mist clings to her hair like a veil of ghosts. The young queen steps onto English soil with trembling grace, her small gloved hand clutching a golden cross, her eyes full of hope. She bows to the crowd, smiling, but few smile back. The Puritans cross themselves, the merchants whisper, and somewhere among them, a preacher mutters, "The devil wears silk this day." At Whitehall Palace, the first meeting of husband and wife is a tableau of opposites. Charles, pale, reserved, his words careful and measured. Henrietta, alive with emotion, her voice like song, her laughter quick and unguarded. They speak in broken tongues, his French hesitant, her English uncertain, yet their eyes understand what words cannot. In her, Charles finds something rare, warmth, devotion, a companion who mirrors his belief that kingship is divine, that love too is sanctified by heaven. In him, Henrietta finds duty, strength, and a kind of quiet poetry. For all their differences, they are drawn together not by politics, but by faith. Their letters, written in the delicate script of lovers and monarchs, reveal a bond both tender and absolute. "My dearest heart," Charles writes, "I am yours entirely, body and soul." Henrietta replies, "I would rather be a beggar with you than a queen without you." In the dark corners of history, these words still glimmer, proof that amidst war, suspicion, and death, love can still bloom like a candle in the storm. But outside the palace walls, love becomes politics. Her chapel at Somerset House, fragrant with incense and adorned with painted saints, becomes a symbol of division. To the faithful, it is beauty reborn. To the Puritans, it is heresy unveiled. Priests in scarlet robes whisper Latin prayers, bells toll for Mass, and in the streets beyond, English hearts harden. Charles defends her, fiercely, publicly. "The Queen shall worship as her conscience commands," he declares. But each defense isolates him further. Every concession to her faith drives a deeper wedge between the king and his people. Within Whitehall, the two worlds cannot reconcile. Henrietta's ladies-in-waiting, French and Catholic, clash with English courtiers. Her confessor refuses to bow to Anglican clergy. Rumors spread of plots, of papal influence, of hidden gold flowing from Rome to London. Parliament grows restless. The Puritan press mocks the Queen as a sorceress in silk, a temptress who whispers foreign sins into the ear of England's king. And Charles, ever steadfast, ever proud, shuts his doors to them all. In defending her, he begins to alienate his people. In loving her, he sets himself apart from the nation he swore to guide. Their love, once tender, becomes strained beneath the weight of suspicion. Henrietta's tears fall behind closed doors. Charles retreats to his chapel, praying for strength. Yet even in silence, their hearts remain bound. For every quarrel ends with forgiveness, every night with prayer. They believe that God himself has joined them, and that no mortal parliament can tear them apart. But faith, like love, can divide as well as unite. For the first time, Charles begins to rule not as a man balancing kingdoms, but as one convinced of divine purpose, and beside him stands a queen who shares that certainty, that their marriage, their crowns, their trials are ordained. Yet outside the rain falls heavier. The streets darken, the preachers thunder louder, and unseen in the mist, the Parliament sharpens its resolve. The union of Charles and Henrietta was not merely the joining of two hearts. It was the collision of two worlds. Catholic and Protestant, France and England, faith and fear. Their love would defy nations, and, in time, destroy one. In the quiet of Whitehall, the king gazes upon his queen as lightning flashes through stained glass. For a moment, the light paints them in gold, radiant, eternal. Then the glow fades, and shadow returns. What began as love sanctified by heaven will soon become a trial ordained by destiny, a union forged in prayer, tested by politics, and sealed by tragedy. London, 1625. The air within Westminster is thick, not just with candle smoke and ink, but with suspicion. Outside, the city's bells toll softly, marking another dawn beneath a monarch who believes he is chosen by God. Inside, men of law, merchants, and country gentlemen gather, men who believe that God's favor does not silence reason. This is the House of Commons, the voice of the nation newly awakened. They have grown weary of the whispers that drift from court corridors, whispers of indulgence, corruption, and of a king whose loyalty seems divided between heaven and his own ambition. From the very beginning, Charles's reign is troubled by money and by trust. The crown is drowning in debt from his father's wars, and now Charles dreams of new campaigns against Spain, against France, against any who threaten the Protestant cause. But Parliament has seen enough ruin and waste. They question his motives. They question his companions. And at the center of their anger stands one man, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. To Parliament, Buckingham is everything that's wrong with the Stuart court. A man raised not by merit, but by royal affection. A soldier without victories. A courtier whose wealth grows as the nation bleeds. He governs the king, one member declares, and through him, tyranny governs England. Yet to Charles, Buckingham is more than an advisor. He is a brother in faith, a companion in loneliness. When the world doubts him, Buckingham believes. When his queen prays in French and his parliament curses in English, Buckingham stands by him. It is loyalty, blinding, dangerous, and absolute. Parliament moves to impeach Buckingham on charges of corruption and incompetence. Charles intervenes. He forbids their judgment. He commands their silence. Kings, he reminds them, are accountable only to God. But those words, meant to assert divine right, instead ignite defiance. For the first time, Parliament sees not just a bad minister, but a dangerous idea. If the king can command obedience without question, what stops him from ruling without them at all? Outside Westminster, pamphlets spread through London's streets. Printers whisper by candlelight. The people read of popish plots, French influence, and the Queen's secret mass at Somerset House. The word tyranny begins to appear in ink, in sermons, and in the hearts of men. Charles calls this treason. Parliament calls it conscience. When Parliament refuses to grant him funds, Charles dissolves it, not once but twice. Each time he swears he will not be defied again. Each time the anger grows louder. By 1629, the bond between Crown and Commons has snapped. Charles, pale and determined, walks through Whitehall's shadowed corridors and whispers to his council, "I will govern alone." Thus begins what history will call the personal rule, or, as his enemies name it, the 11 years' tyranny. For over a decade, no parliament sits in England. No debate, no vote, no challenge. Charles rules by decree, collecting taxes without consent, enforcing laws of his own design. His courts are filled with loyal bishops and silent judges. His agents travel the land, demanding payment for wars that never come, for ships that never sail. And yet, beneath this quiet order, something festers. The people grow restless. Ministers whisper of papist sympathies. Puritan preachers thunder from the pulpit about Babylon, about the whore of Rome, about a king who bends his knee too easily to Catholic ways. In portraits, Charles appears serene, a divine monarch crowned in calm light, painted by Van Dyck as though blessed by heaven. But behind the canvas lies strain, empty coffers, foreign isolation, and a queen increasingly distrusted by her own people. While he seeks order, his silence becomes provocation. While he believes he restores peace, his very stillness breeds rebellion. Each act of defiance he suppresses only strengthens the belief that England itself must rise to reclaim its voice. 11 years will pass before Parliament sits again. 11 years in which England changes, silently and profoundly. The seeds of civil war take root in silence, watered by resentment, fed by faith. The stage is set, the lines are drawn, and though Charles believes he has silenced opposition, the echo of those dissolved parliaments will one day return, not as voices, but as armies. What began as a dispute over taxes and loyalty has become a question of faith and freedom. In seeking to rule as God's chosen king, Charles has forgotten that even kings are mortal, and that power, unshared, is power that consumes itself. Alone in the great halls of Whitehall and Hampton Court, Charles walked not as a ruler of men, but as a servant of heaven. The echoes of Parliament's protests had long since fallen silent, replaced by psalms and whispers of angels painted on cathedral ceilings. Here, amid candlelight and the scent of burning incense, he sought meaning, not in the voice of the people, but in the stillness of prayer. Art became his sanctuary. Van Dyck painted him as no mere mortal king, but as a sacred figure, calm amid chaos, gazing heavenward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of divine authority. "A king," Charles once wrote, "is God's lieutenant upon earth." To him, kingship was not earned. It was ordained, a calling sanctified by heaven's own hand. In his private chapel, he would kneel for hours before the altar, his crown resting beside him, his lips whispering the same prayers that had filled his father's dying chamber. "Lord, give me patience under thy hand." But outside the palace, patience had long since run dry. In the villages and market squares of England, whispers grew louder, that the king's silence was not piety, but pride. That his taxes were not just burdens, but chains. That his bishops were not shepherds of God, but servants of Rome. For 11 long years, no parliament met. No voice of the people spoke. And yet, from the pulpits and printing presses of London to the fields of Yorkshire, resistance began to speak in its own tongue, sermons, pamphlets, and prayer. Puritan preachers filled their chapels with thunder, crying that England had fallen under judgment, that idolatry walked once more among them. "The king believes he speaks for God," one minister warned, "but perhaps God no longer listens." For every altar Charles adorned, they tore another down. For every stained-glass saint he restored, they shattered one in defiance. The faith that once united England now divided it like a sword. Meanwhile, royal agents collected ship money, a tax once meant only for wartime defense, now demanded from all, in peace and in silence. "The king requires," they would say. "The people will obey." But obedience came with bitterness. In humble homes and manor halls alike, men began to ask, if the king could take without consent, what could he not take? Justice? Liberty? Their very souls? And yet Charles believed he governed justly. His was not tyranny, he thought, but order. His hand was steady, his conscience clear. When he walked the galleries of Whitehall, lined with paintings of prophets and kings, he felt not guilt, but grace. Every portrait, every hymn, every polished floor was another reflection of divine perfection, a mirror of heaven's peace upon earth. But perfection has a price. For all his devotion, Charles failed to see that his England was no longer still. In Scotland, rebellion stirred, a people who would not kneel before his bishops, nor accept his English prayer book. The bishops' wars erupted. Battles fought not just over faith, but over the right to speak to God in one's own tongue. For the first time in his reign, Charles faced a force he could not command, a rebellion born not from treason, but from conscience. Armies marched north. Treasuries emptied. The king's serene world of candlelight and art cracked beneath the weight of need. He could not fund his soldiers without Parliament, the very body he had silenced. And so, in 1640, after 11 years of divine solitude, Charles I, the king who claimed to answer only to God, was forced to summon once more the voices of men. They came not in loyalty, but in judgment. Men who remembered their dismissal, their humiliation. Men who no longer saw a king, but a man cloaked in sanctity and stubbornness. The parliament he had dissolved now returned as his reckoning. And in its echoing hall, the question that had haunted England for a generation rose again. Is the king above the law, or beneath it? Charles believed himself God's chosen, a shepherd anointed to guard his flock, but the flock no longer followed. They questioned, resisted, rebelled, and as faith hardened into ideology and devotion into division, the divine king found himself alone, surrounded by believers, yet abandoned by belief. Thus the divine king became the isolated king, a man trapped between heaven and earth, praying to a God who had grown silent, ruling a realm that no longer listened. The light that once crowned him in Van Dyck's portraits now flickered like a candle in a storm, steady, beautiful, but doomed to fade. The sanctity of kingship had become its curse, and in the shadow of that faith, proud, devout, unyielding, the first cracks of England's coming civil war began to sound. The silence that had once cloaked England was breaking. What began as murmurs among ministers and pamphleteers now roared like the rising sea. The crown that once gleamed untarnished beneath heaven's light now bore its first deep cracks. Charles I, the king anointed by sacred oil and crowned beneath the cross, believed his authority came not from men, but from God alone. Yet in that unyielding belief lay the seed of ruin, for faith untempered by balance becomes fire, and fire consumes what it means to protect. When Charles sought to bind his kingdoms under one church, one prayer, one God, he struck the match that would light a continent. The new Book of Common Prayer, crafted in English cadence and royal certainty, was to be read in every Scottish kirk. But Scotland, fierce in its covenant with God, would not kneel before England's altar. In St. Giles's Cathedral, a noblewoman hurled her stool at the dean who dared read from the king's book. And with that small defiance, rebellion began. From kirk to castle, the cry spread like wildfire, "No bishop, no king!" And the northern winds that once whispered prayers now carried the drums of war. Charles raised his banners and called his armies, but a decade of peace had dulled the sword, and the coffers that once brimmed with gold now echoed hollow. The divine right of kings, it seemed, could not pay for muskets. His soldiers marched ill-equipped, their loyalty fraying beneath the weight of hunger and doubt. The king's banners fluttered proudly, but behind them stood men weary of faith and fearful of famine. Scotland's armies, fired by conviction, drove them back. Defeat came not from the sword alone, but from the poverty of power. Desperate for coin, Charles turned to the one body he had silenced: Parliament. 11 years had passed since he dissolved them. 11 years of rule by decree. 11 years of isolation between crown and country. But necessity bends even kings. He summoned the Commons again, hoping for obedience. Yet when the great doors of Westminster swung open, the men who entered were not his servants, they were his accusers. They came not to serve the king, but to judge him, to demand account for every shilling taken, every man imprisoned, every prayer imposed. The air was thick with words unspoken for a decade, grievances long buried, now resurrected with righteous fury. They questioned the taxes, the wars, the bishops, and at last, the belief itself that one man could rule by God's will alone. For the first time in English history, Parliament asked the unthinkable: was the king subject to the law? And if not, what law remained? In the great hall, Charles sat in silent dignity, his posture unbending, his eyes steady and sad. To him, these men were not representatives of the people. They were rebels against the natural order. He saw himself as the shepherd of a wayward flock, and their defiance as sin. Kings are not bound to give account to subjects, he whispered to a confidant, for God alone judges princes. Yet outside the palace walls, the wind carried a different gospel, one that spoke of liberty, conscience, and the will of man. England was dividing not merely in politics, but in belief. Heaven itself seemed to withdraw from the quarrel, leaving only silence where once divine favor had shone. At Whitehall, the king paced by candlelight, the walls heavy with portraits of his ancestors: Henry's resolve, Elizabeth's fire, James's wisdom. Their painted eyes followed him, serene and eternal, as if to remind him that he carried both their glory and their ghosts. But even ghosts cannot guide a man whose faith has become his fortress. Charles believed God would vindicate him, not through compromise, but through suffering, as saints are tested by fire. His prayers became battles within his soul. He saw the hand of providence in every trial, and the work of Satan in every opposition. And thus the stage was set, for a king who could not yield and a people who would not kneel. Across England, towns prepared for what no one dared name aloud. Muskets were oiled, armor drawn from the dust. Sermons thundered from pulpits, some calling for obedience, others for resistance. Families divided, brother turned against brother. The line between loyalty and rebellion blurred like smoke. In the eyes of the faithful, this was not merely a political struggle. It was a holy war. Between God's ordained order and man's conscience, between crown and covenant, between heaven and earth. The storm that Charles had summoned with his own prayers now gathered full above him. Lightning split the clouds above Whitehall. Thunder rolled over the Thames like the sound of drums in judgment. The silence of heaven was complete, and soon that silence would be shattered by the thunder of civil war. The divine king stood alone beneath the weight of his crown, still unbroken, still believing, as the storm he had called upon began to fall. Thus began the long unraveling, the slow collapse of divine order under the weight of human pride. The crown that once symbolized unity now stood divided, caught between heaven and earth. And in the heart of the man who wore it, silence deepened into destiny. The war for England's soul had already begun, not on the battlefield, but in the conscience of a king. The reign of Charles Stuart began not in the blaze of triumph, but in the solemn hush of shadow. England, weary from plague, debt, and the echoes of war, awaited a sovereign of strength and unity, a ruler to guide the kingdom toward a gentler age. Instead, they received a man of silence, a king whose power was born not of laughter or persuasion, but of stillness and unshakable faith. From childhood, Charles had lived in the shadow of inadequacy. He had been the sickly son, frail and withdrawn, forever standing in the long silhouette of his elder brother Henry, the prince destined for greatness. But when Henry died suddenly, the fragile boy became the heir to a throne that terrified him as much as it exalted him. Where his father, James VI and the First, had been a man of words, witty, argumentative, fond of public debate, Charles was introspective, private, and cautious. He mistrusted speech as much as his father had loved it. He found truth not in discourse, but in devotion. His world was one of ritual, order, and beauty. The soft glow of candles, the harmony of choirs, the solemn choreography of faith. To him, the monarchy was not an invention of men, nor a convenience of government. It was an act of God. A crown, once placed upon the head of a king, did not merely grant authority, it bestowed sanctity. The monarch became the living vessel of divine will, a shepherd appointed by heaven itself to guard the souls of his people. This belief, the divine right of kings, was no empty phrase to Charles. It was the very marrow of his being, the creed by which he rose in the morning and knelt in prayer by night. In the quiet of his chamber, he would read from the Psalms, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And in that sacred verse, he saw reflection. For if God was shepherd of man, then was not the king shepherd of his realm. On the day of his coronation, in the great Abbey of Westminster, Charles walked beneath vaulted ceilings that had echoed with the oaths of kings for centuries. He knelt before the altar, head bowed, as holy oil was poured upon his brow. The scent of anointing balm filled the air, rich with myrrh, olive, and cedar, and as the archbishop's voice intoned the sacred words, Charles felt himself not merely crowned, but transformed. No longer the hesitant prince, he was now God's chosen lieutenant on earth. To disobey him would be to defy heaven itself. The golden orb placed in his hand symbolized dominion over the world. But Charles did not see it as power to command, rather as burden to bear. The sword he was given was not for conquest, but for justice. The scepter not for vanity, but for stewardship. Yet within these symbols of duty and faith lay a dangerous illusion. For to believe oneself anointed by heaven is to mistake conviction for infallibility. As the years unfolded, Charles's devotion hardened into dogma. He prayed not merely for guidance, but for vindication, for the strength to stand firm against all opposition. And when that opposition came, from Parliament, from preachers, from the restless voices of his people, he saw not fellow Englishmen, but rebels against divine order. To Charles, the realm was a body, and he its head. The health of the kingdom depended upon unity, obedience, and faith. A body divided was a body diseased. But the England he inherited was restless, its spirit torn between old piety and new freedom, between the solemn rituals of bishops and the raw fervor of Puritan faith. The people no longer looked to kings as sacred vessels. They looked to themselves, to conscience, to the word written in Scripture rather than decreed from the throne. Yet Charles could not see the change. To him, the noise of Parliament, the preaching of reformers, and the murmur of the streets were all one, a cacophony of insolence. He believed that by silence and majesty he could restore order, as a priest restores reverence to a sanctuary. But faith without compassion breeds isolation, and authority without humility breeds fear. In the stillness of Whitehall, Charles walked alone among the tapestries of his ancestors. Their portraits stared down, stern kings, triumphant queens, each face a reminder of the weight he bore. The crown was both halo and shackle, the throne both altar and prison. Night after night, he would retreat to his private chapel, where the glow of candles cast golden light upon carved angels. He would kneel before the crucifix, whispering prayers not for glory, but for endurance. To him, kingship was sacrifice, a holy wound to be carried in silence. And yet, beyond those sacred walls, his subjects whispered a different gospel, one of liberty, representation, and accountability. To them, the king's silence was not reverence, but disdain. His stillness, not strength, but pride. Thus began the unseen war of perception, a battle not of swords, but of ideals. Charles saw himself as the guardian of divine truth. His people began to see him as an idol to be toppled, and between crown and commoner, between altar and assembly, a chasm widened, quiet at first, then echoing with every passing year. Yet even as discontent grew, Charles remained steadfast. He believed that the world could not be governed by the passions of men, but only by the wisdom of God, as interpreted through the king he had chosen. And so he endured. He prayed. He waited. For if his rule was ordained by heaven, then surely heaven would preserve it. But faith is not shield enough against time. And as the storm clouds gathered over England, political, religious, and human, Charles stood firm beneath the deluge, believing still that he could not be wrong. For how could one chosen by God err? How could the divine hand falter? Yet beneath the gold and the silence, beneath the prayers and the portraits, the truth remained. Charles was a man, fragile and flawed, seeking eternity in a world that had already begun to change. Thus began the reign of Charles I, not with thunderous applause or the clang of victory, but with a whisper of prayer in an empty chapel and the first trembling note of a storm yet to come. In the kingdom of Charles Stuart, religion was not simply worship, it was identity. It was politics, family, conscience, and crown. The wounds of the Reformation, though decades old, still wept beneath the surface of English life. Protestant and Puritan, Anglican and Catholic, all were bound by a shared book, but torn apart by differing interpretations of its words. To be English was to be defined by how and to whom one prayed. The Church of England, once the proud creation of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, now stood at a crossroads. To many, it had become a compromise without conviction, neither fully Protestant nor truly Catholic, a relic of royal vanity wrapped in Scripture. But to Charles, the Church was sacred. It was order. It was beauty made visible, a mirror of heaven's harmony upon earth. The king did not love austerity. He loved reverence. Where Puritan pulpits thundered with raw words and wooden benches, Charles found God in marble, music, and light. He believed that the divine could not dwell amid filth and noise, but in splendor, in gold leaf, in harmony, in the careful symmetry of ceremony. And so he began to reshape the church, not as a meeting place of the people, but as a sanctuary of majesty. But in doing so, he stepped into the chasm that had swallowed monarchs before him, the divide between faith and freedom. The Puritans saw his vision as corruption. To them, the church was the house of God, not a theater of kings. They preached that salvation was born in Scripture, not ceremony, in grace, not grandeur. To kneel before an altar draped in silk was, in their eyes, to bow before Rome itself, to resurrect the old idolatry England had bled to destroy. And yet Charles could not see heresy, only harmony disrupted. To him, rebellion against the altar was rebellion against heaven. In William Laud, Bishop of London, and soon Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles found both ally and reflection. Laud, small in stature but unbending in conviction, believed that the church was not a marketplace of opinions, but a vessel of divine order. He loathed the noise of unlicensed preaching, the chaos of self-proclaimed prophets. For him, the altar was not a table. It was the axis of creation, where heaven touched earth. And like his king, he believed that beauty itself was a form of worship. Together, king and archbishop transformed England's churches into temples of awe. Candles glowed again where darkness had reigned. Painted saints returned to walls scrubbed bare by iconoclasts. Choirs sang in Latin harmonies that rolled like thunder through vaulted roofs. The senses, sight, sound, scent, became the language of faith once more. But for every worshipper moved to tears by glory, 100 more felt betrayed. They saw the king's church as the devil's compromise, a gilded mask for tyranny. The Puritans whispered that Laud's cathedrals were temples to the Antichrist, that Charles himself was in league with Rome. In taverns and town squares, his subjects began to call him the Popish King, and in that single word, Popish, lay all the fury of a nation scarred by faith. The Puritans were not without power. Many were merchants, scholars, and members of Parliament. Men who had built England's rising wealth through labor, not lineage. They despised the decadence of court life, the feasting, the silks, the silent king who rarely smiled and never compromised. To them, Charles's silence was arrogance. His reverence was idolatry. His faith was tyranny wrapped in prayer. Yet Charles believed himself misunderstood. His was not tyranny, it was obedience. To disobey Parliament was not to defy the people, but to defend divine truth. If kings were anointed by God, how could their authority be subject to debate? What man could vote against the will of heaven? In that conviction lay the seed of his downfall. For where his father, James I, had loved discourse, Charles loved silence. He ruled not by persuasion, but by conscience. And conscience, when unchallenged, becomes its own god. Parliament bristled at the king's new laws and taxes. To fund his wars and cathedrals, Charles had found new ways to draw gold from his subjects. The ship money, the forced loans, the royal monopolies. Each edict was justified by scripture. Each challenge was silenced with royal grace. And all the while, Laud's agents scoured the churches, removing plain wooden altars and replacing them with gilded shrines. Ministers who refused were stripped of their pulpits, their families cast into poverty. The sermons of England became a battlefield. From the pulpits of London to the chapels of the shires, voices thundered either for the king or against him. The Bible, once a source of unity, became a weapon, each side wielding it to prove that God was theirs. In 1637, the king and Laud reached for the impossible, to bring order to Scotland, a land fierce in faith, proud in defiance. They sent forth a new prayer book, written not by Scots, but by English bishops, and on the first Sunday of its reading, in the great cathedral of St. Giles, Edinburgh, a single act of rebellion shattered the illusion of unity. A woman, Jenny Geddes, hurled her stool at the minister's head and screamed, "Dost thou dare read that papist book?" The stool struck wood, and history turned. The congregation erupted in chaos. The service collapsed into shouting, curses, and blows. Within weeks, rebellion spread through Scotland like wildfire, the birth of the Covenanters' revolt. To Charles, it was heresy. To the Scots, it was deliverance. To England, it was the sound of thunder rolling across the border, the first storm of war. Still, the king would not yield. He saw not rebellion, but blasphemy, the defiance of God's ordained servant. Yet for all his prayers and fasts, the truth was inescapable. The divine order he believed in had begun to unravel. The very faith he sought to preserve was now the weapon of his undoing. And so England began to split along invisible lines of faith, of conscience, of loyalty. Preacher against bishop, citizen against crown. And at the center of it all stood one man, a king who spoke softly, ruled devoutly, and could not bend. His silence had become the language of defiance, his faith the voice of power, and power, untempered by mercy, was leading him step by step toward the cross. Thus the sacred music of Charles's reign began to falter, its harmony broken by doubt, its melody overtaken by the march of time. The altar he had built in reverence would soon become a stage for ruin, and the prayers that once sanctified his rule would one day echo over his fall. London, 1625. The young king sits upon his throne, serene in posture, yet storming within. To his right, the royal advisers murmur of taxes, fleets, and the need for coin. To his left, the commons rise, men of land, merchants of the city, voices sharp with conviction and memory. Between them, only air and centuries of resentment. Parliament had long been a tool of the crown, summoned and dismissed as needed. But now, the old balance trembled. The commons had found their courage. They spoke of liberty, of conscience, of law written not by God's anointed, but by men themselves. The debate begins, cautious, deliberate, deadly. Charles listens, jaw set, eyes cold. He believes himself chosen, not elected, but ordained. He cannot bend to the will of Parliament without wounding the divine fabric of kingship itself. Yet to resist them is to court chaos, their words cut deep, accusations of tyranny, of corruption, of popish sympathies, and extravagant courts. Charles answers in the only language he knows, silence, then decree. The king, he writes, is answerable to none but God. His faith, once gentle, now hardens into shield and spear. Each sermon at Whitehall becomes a defense of divine monarchy. Bishops thunder of obedience and order. Laud's voice rises, proud, commanding. The voice of a church remade in royal image. Yet outside the chapel walls, another chorus grows, raw, furious, and Protestant to the bone. They sing of liberty, of the purity of the word. They do not bow. They do not kneel. They whisper that the king's altar smells not of incense but of Rome. The kingdom begins to divide, not by sword, but by sermon. By 1626, Parliament demands blood. They turn their fury on the Duke of Buckingham, Charles's beloved companion, his mirror, his weakness. He drains the treasury, they cry, and corrupts the crown. Charles will not hear it. He defends Buckingham as a brother, as if to strike the Duke were to strike himself. Parliament refuses to grant funds for war. The king dissolves them with a word. The doors slam shut on centuries of fragile cooperation. Yet war still calls, France, Spain, the seas, and the ships will not sail without silver. So the king turns to forced loans. Men are summoned, taxed without consent. Those who refuse are imprisoned. The jails fill with names, gentlemen, merchants, Puritans, scholars, not rebels yet, but seeds waiting for storm. 1628. The petition of right is laid before the throne, a parchment of rebellion disguised as plea. It speaks of liberties ancient and English, no taxation without parliament, no imprisonment without cause, no martial law in times of peace. The king's hand trembles. His father's ghost whispers behind him, "Yield nothing, for kings who yield are soon unmade." For a moment, the crown feels heavy. For a moment, he considers peace. But pride, like iron, shapes his answer. "This petition I grant, in such manner as is fitting for a king." Parliament reads the words, hollow as wind through a graveyard. They see not compromise, but deceit. The gavel falls again, and the age of cooperation ends. Charles dissolves Parliament once more. The chamber darkens. No applause, no protest, only the scrape of chairs on stone and the echo of history ending. Thus begins the king's long solitude. 11 years without Parliament, 11 years of rule by divine decree. To his admirers, it is personal rule. To his critics, the 11 years' tyranny. 1629. In these years, England becomes an island of quiet fear. Royal courts gleam with ceremony and art, while beyond the palace gates, fields whisper with famine and discontent. The king builds cathedrals, not bridges, paintings, not policies. His court dazzles with music and masque, illusions of harmony masking the hunger beneath. The people grow restless. The Puritans flee to New England. Their sermons cross the sea like sparks in wind. The old nobility mutter in closed halls. Merchants grumble over taxes and trade. And in the north, Scotland seethes, the flame of resistance rekindled by faith. Alone at his desk, Charles writes, not letters to Parliament nor to the people, but to God. Each word a confession, a justification, a prayer. I have sought thee, Lord, in all things, and found thee most when all men forsake me. The crown glimmers beside him, its jewels reflecting candlelight. Each gem a world, each sparkle a promise, each shadow a warning. In that glow, he feels again his father's presence, his lineage stretching back through saints and kings. To doubt divine right would be to unravel his soul, and so he clings to faith, faith not as comfort, but as weapon. Yet outside those palace walls, another faith grows louder, the faith of parliament, of preacher, of soldier. A faith that whispers, God does not dwell in crowns. The world has changed, but the king cannot hear it. He believes the silence of parliament means obedience, but it is the silence of gathering armies. When the storm breaks, it will not come as a shout, but as a prayer, turned against its maker. The battle between heaven and earth will be fought not in foreign fields, but within the heart of England itself. And when that battle comes, it will not only decide a crown, it will define what it means to rule and to rebel in the name of God. Thus ends the peace of kings, the silence before the sword. Power, once shared, now rested entirely in the hands of one man, a king whose silence had become his crown and whose solitude had hardened into faith. Charles had dismissed his parliament. He had cast aside the counsel of those who had once dared to question him. Now the kingdom was his alone, not in unity, but in burden. He ruled not through compromise, but through conviction. For in his mind, the throne was no seat of earthly governance. It was a pulpit, an altar, an instrument of God's divine order. But divine solitude carried a heavy price. Without parliament, there was no purse. Without purse, there was no army, no navy, no mechanism through which a kingdom might breathe. And so, in the year 1634, the king turned to the forgotten instruments of medieval rule, relics of an older time when monarchs were not questioned, but obeyed. Among these was ship money, an ancient coastal levy once demanded of maritime towns for the defense of England's shores. Yet now, in the silence of royal decree, Charles extended that tax inland, to every county, every town, every farmer who tilled soil far from the sea's reach. The reason, he believed, was righteous. The crown, after all, was charged with the defense of the realm. If the people lived under God's peace, should they not bear the cost of God's protection? Each royal writ that left the king's chambers carried the weight of divine authority. The wax seals glistened red under candlelight, marked with the lion and unicorn, symbols of an ancient contract between monarch and heaven. To Charles, it was not greed, it was order, it was duty. To resist the crown's will was not merely rebellion, it was sin. And yet, across the parishes and manors of England, men began to murmur that the king's will had overstepped its heavenly bounds. In market squares and taverns, whispers grew bold. The merchants grumbled that the crown's collectors had come too often, their ledgers too thick with royal demands. The gentry spoke in private over wine and flickering lamplight, of overreach and tyranny. And in the pulpit, Puritan preachers thundered of corruption, of popery within the palace, of a queen whose rosary was said to poison the soul of England's king. Henrietta Maria, elegant, foreign, devout, became the symbol of everything feared by the Protestant heart. Her chapels glowed with incense and candlelight. Her prayers rose in Latin. Her court gathered musicians and painters whose art celebrated the sacred mysteries of the Catholic faith. To her husband, it was beauty, a glimpse of heaven's order, a reflection of divine harmony. But to his subjects, it was treachery wrapped in silk and devotion. Within Whitehall and Hampton Court, Charles surrounded himself with splendor, music, sculpture, the portraits of Van Dyck. Each painting captured not merely his likeness, but his belief. A king serene, divinely chosen, set apart from the vulgar clamor of mortal men. Yet beyond those painted halls, England stirred. Fields lay barren after years of heavy tithe. Townsfolk counted their silver with trembling fingers. Shipyards echoed with the hammering of laborers who cursed under their breath. For the ships they built no longer defended the coast, but financed the will of one man. The king's peace, they called it, though few felt peace at all. In 1637, the king's solitude deepened into delusion. He ordered the Book of Common Prayer to be read in every church of England and Scotland alike. A uniform worship, an enforced harmony beneath the gaze of one sovereign God. But the Scots, fierce, proud, devout, would not bow. In St. Giles's Cathedral, the prayer was read aloud only once before riot broke like thunder across the pews. A stool was thrown at the bishop's head, and with that defiant act, the voice of rebellion returned to Britain. For a decade, Charles had ruled without parliament. Now the silence he had imposed was shattered by a single act of faith. Faith against faith. Across the realm, the notion of divine right began to fracture. What had once been the sacred foundation of monarchy, that kings ruled by heaven's command, now seemed hollow, an echo of a forgotten age. Even among those who had served him faithfully, unease crept like frost. Could the king who believed himself chosen by God truly hear the voice of his people? Or had the voice of heaven become a mask for pride? In his solitude, Charles mistook obedience for faith and silence for loyalty. He saw the discontent of his realm not as grievance, but as trial, a test of his divine calling. And so he endured, certain that God watched from above, certain that righteousness would prevail. Yet every tax collected, every sermon silenced, every prayer rewritten in the king's name drove England further from the peace he sought to preserve. Thus began the slow, invisible unraveling. A nation split between heaven and earth, between law and belief. And in the center of it all stood Charles, not as tyrant, not as fool, but as a man bound to his own sacred solitude. A king who sought to serve God's will, yet could no longer hear the voice of his people. And when the storm finally came, when the voice of Parliament rose once more, it would not come as a whisper of reason, but as a roar of judgment. The price of divine solitude was not measured in gold or in blood, but in the breaking of trust. The moment when a kingdom ceased to believe that its king spoke for God. By the late 1630s, Charles I stood at the height of his solitude, surrounded by beauty, yet imprisoned within his own belief. For 11 long years, no parliament had been summoned. No voice but his own dared speak the language of law or faith. In the stillness of his court, surrounded by paintings and priests, Charles convinced himself that he had achieved divine order, that heaven itself smiled upon his reign. Yet beyond the palace walls, silence was not peace. It was pressure, gathering like a storm beneath the surface of obedience. In 1637, the king sought to complete what his father, James I, had only dreamed of, the unification of worship under one divine voice. To Charles, it was not conquest, but consecration, an act of sacred alignment, binding England and Scotland beneath the same liturgy, the same creed, the same prayer to God. His reasoning was devout. How could one king serve two altars? How could one faith be divided within the same crown? And so he commanded the reading of the Book of Common Prayer in every Scottish kirk. The book was beautiful, filled with scripture, ceremony, and reverence. But its beauty was English. Its words, its cadence, its pageantry, all bore the scent of a southern church that the Scots had fought for a century to resist. On a grey Sunday morning in Edinburgh's St. Giles Cathedral, The first reading began. The dean, robed in white, ascended the pulpit. Outside, the sky hung heavy with rain. Inside, the air trembled, not with devotion, but with dread. The first words of the new liturgy left his lips, and in that moment, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth collided. From the pews, a stool flew through the air, hurled by a woman named Jenny Geddes, her cry sharp and furious. "Daur ye say mass in my lug!" Her stool struck the pulpit with a thunderous echo. The congregation erupted. Men shouted, women wept, psalms dissolved into shouts of rage. And thus rebellion was born, not in battlefields nor in royal chambers, but in the heart of a church. One act of defiance became the match that would set a kingdom aflame. Across Scotland, the fires of resistance spread. From kirk to kirk, from city to countryside, sermons turned into declarations. The faithful took up pens and swords alike. They called themselves the Covenanters, men and women who bound their souls to God and one another in a sacred oath, swearing to defend their faith against all innovations of religion. The document they signed, the National Covenant, was no mere petition. It was scripture forged from defiance. With trembling hands and burning hearts, they vowed to resist the king's decree, to protect the purity of their worship from what they saw as tyranny in holy robes. Charles, in his court at Whitehall, received word of the covenant. He read it in silence. His face, once serene, tightened with disbelief. In his eyes, it was not rebellion, it was blasphemy. To challenge the king's word was to challenge the divine will itself. And so the man who had ruled without parliament for 11 years now found himself preparing for war. A war not of ambition, but of faith. Yet war, like faith, demands sacrifice, and sacrifice demands gold. The royal coffers, drained by years of peace and pride, stood nearly empty. The collectors returned to their towns with empty hands. There was only one way forward, one door left unopened. After a decade of divine solitude, Charles was forced to do the unthinkable. He summoned Parliament. The year was 1640. The old hall of Parliament filled once more with the sound of men's voices, but they were not the same voices he had silenced 11 years before. They were harder now, tempered by loss and principle. When Charles entered, the assembly did not bow as deeply as it once had. The air in the chamber was thick, not with incense, but with righteous anger. The smell of ink and sweat and vengeance mingled beneath the vaulted ceiling. Every man there carried a pen as if it were a blade. Their first words were not of loyalty, but of law. They demanded redress for years of arbitrary rule, for forced taxes, for imprisoned Puritans, for the arrogance that had turned divine right into divine deafness. Charles listened, his hands clasped tight behind his back. He smiled, the calm, unreadable smile of a man who believed himself still untouchable. Yet in that chamber, for the first time in his reign, his words carried less weight than theirs. Parliament spoke in Scripture as much as he did. They quoted the Bible to rebuke him, preached liberty in the language of prophecy. The divine order he had built upon faith began to crumble beneath the force of men who believed they too served God, but through conscience, not crown. The age of divine solitude had ended. In its place, a new age dawned, one of reckoning, of conflict, of blood and prayer. The fracture between heaven and earth was complete. The king who believed himself chosen by God now stood judged by men who claimed to speak for him. In that fragile collision, between faith and reason, between pulpit and parliament, England took its first irreversible step towards civil war. And though the storm had only just begun, the end was already written, not in the heavens above, but in the hearts of those who no longer feared the crown. For Charles, faith was strength, but faith, when unbending, can become stone. He believed the crown was his cross to bear, a sacred duty above compromise, above counsel, above men. Yet in his isolation, the crown became not a symbol of salvation, but a halo of ruin. He sought to unite heaven and earth under his rule, and instead, he divided them forever. The year is 1642. England stands on the edge of its own destruction. The rivers of loyalty and faith that once flowed into the crown now divide, bleeding into war. Charles I, once the anointed of God, now faces subjects who no longer see heaven reflected in his throne. Parliament demands reform. The king demands obedience. Between them, the air thickens with suspicion, sanctity, and the stench of coming death. London murmurs with unrest, whispers in taverns, sermons from pulpits, and the rustle of parchment filled with accusations. The kingdom no longer breathes as one body but as two, royalist and parliamentarian, each claiming to fight for England, each claiming to serve God. The storm that had gathered in words is ready to break in blood. It begins not with a trumpet, but with a prayer. Across the land, men sharpen swords beside their Bibles, believing themselves soldiers of righteousness. For Charles, war is divine duty, a trial by heaven's judgment. He rides through the shires, banners streaming behind him, his armor polished to silver brightness. The people kneel as he passes, yet many hesitate, their loyalty curdled by fear. In Oxford, he establishes his court in exile, a mirror of lost grandeur. In Westminster, Parliament sharpens its quills and its cannons. Each side invokes God, each side damns the other. The Civil War is not merely a conflict of armies, but of souls. When war comes, it does not roar. It whispers first. Rain falls on muddy fields. The ground trembles with the weight of prayer and fear. At Edgehill, in the grey dawn, two English hosts stare across the mist. Drums beat slow, solemn as church bells. Muskets gleam beneath the clouds. And then, silence breaks. The first volley of Englishmen firing upon Englishmen echoes across the hills. Brother against brother. Father against son. For king or for parliament, for God or for justice, the cries are the same. Faith becomes gunpowder, loyalty becomes ash. The king watches from his command hill, his face unreadable beneath his plumed hat. He believes heaven still favors him, that God's hand guides his sword. But on the battlefield, the heavens remain silent. The war spreads like wildfire. Villages burn, churches crumble, families vanish into the smoke. In every parish, every home, the question divides hearts. For whom do you pray? The royalist cause, once gilded with divine promise, now bleeds from within. The coffers run dry. Soldiers march without pay, without bread, yet still with faith. Charles's armies fight valiantly, at Newbury, at Lostwithiel, at Naseby. But Parliament's ranks grow ever stronger. Their discipline is forged not from birthright, but from belief. Under Oliver Cromwell, the new model army rises, an iron host, convinced that Providence walks beside them. Charles, still noble in bearing, still serene in conviction, refuses to see defeat. He believes that kings do not lose. They are only tested. But the test has already become his undoing. 1646, Oxford falls. The royal standard is torn down. The King of England, the defender of the faith, becomes a prisoner of his own subjects. He surrenders not in humiliation, but in ritual calm. A man who believes the hand that strikes him will be forgiven by God. From confinement, Charles writes letters to his children, to Parliament, to heaven. His words are patient, almost tender. I die as your lawful king, and you die as my people, misled but not unloved. Yet behind every word lies an echo, the sound of chains. The king who claimed divine right must now plead before mortal judgment. Parliament debates not how to rule with their king, but how to rule without him. When compromise fails, desperation takes its place. Charles flees across fields and forests from palace to safe house, seeking refuge among the Scots who once rose against him. They deliver him, not to safety, but to sale. For silver and survival, they hand their king to Parliament. It is betrayal, and yet it is justice. The last chapter of a king who mistook faith for infallibility. Charles stands before his captors not as a ruler, but as a relic. A man still wrapped in the language of holiness, while the world around him speaks of liberty. By 1648, England is exhausted. The fields are graves, the churches silent. The nation has learned to live with ruin. But Charles still writes, still prays, still refuses to bend. His faith remains absolute, his belief that kings rule by divine will unshaken, even as the sky grows darker with smoke. When Parliament votes to bring the king to trial, the air of London thickens with disbelief. No English monarch has ever stood accused by his own people. The court convenes in the Hall of Whitehall, where once his coronation feast was held, now stands his judgment seat. He enters calm, pale, unyielding. The gavel strikes. The echo sounds like prophecy fulfilled. Charles I does not defend himself. He preaches. He speaks of God's anointed, of sacred duty, of the corruption of rebellion. His words are not for mercy, but for martyrdom. The judges call him obstinate. The soldiers call him arrogant. His followers call him saintly. The verdict comes not from law, but from necessity. A kingdom can no longer endure a king who believes himself divine while his people bleed. On January 27, 1649, the sentence is declared. Charles Stuart, King of England, shall be executed as a traitor to his people. The echo of those words shatters centuries of sanctity. The divine right of kings, undone in a single breath. The night is cold, the moon veiled in frost. Charles prays in his cell, his Bible open to the book of Job. He writes one final note, steady, elegant, unbroken. I forgive them with all my heart. Outside, London sleeps uneasily. The streets are lined with soldiers, the square with silence. The executioner sharpens his blade, his face hidden behind black cloth. In the morning, the king will step into legend, his last act, a quiet walk toward destiny. At dawn, the air bites with cold. Charles dresses with care, white silk shirt, so that no one may mistake his blood for fear. He steps from St. James's Palace toward Whitehall, where the scaffold waits. Crowds gather, silent, shivering, countless. Some bow, others weep. A few turn away, unable to bear the sight of a king becoming mortal. He speaks softly to his loyal bishop. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown. Then he kneels, calm, unflinching, resolved. The axe falls. The world stops. A crown drops into history. For a long moment, there is no sound, only the flutter of banners, the sob of the wind. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice cries, "The king is dead!" The soldiers lower their heads. The air smells of iron, of incense, of finality. In the sky above Whitehall, the ravens circle. The throne of England stands empty, but its shadow stretches across centuries. Charles I, the king who believed himself chosen by God, had discovered that divine right cannot outlive human doubt. His death was not the end of monarchy, but its rebirth in humility. In blood and silence, England learned that even a crown must answer to conscience. Winter, 1648. The kingdom trembles under the weight of its own conscience. The rivers are frozen, the streets silent, but beneath that silence, the pulse of judgment beats. The war has ended, yet peace has not come. King Charles I, once anointed by divine right, now stands alone before the tribunal of men. For centuries, monarchs of England ruled by God's will, unquestioned, unchallenged, eternal. But now, in this moment, heaven itself seems to hesitate. The idea of kingship, ancient, sacred, unbroken, faces trial for the first time in history. And in that trial, England will decide not only the fate of its king, but the fate of monarchy itself. They brought him from Carisbrooke Castle, not as sovereign, but as prisoner. Charles rode through streets lined with soldiers, their eyes fixed, their muskets lowered. No cheers, no cries of loyalty, only silence, broken by the caw of crows above Westminster. Inside the palace, once his own, he now slept beneath guards' watch. The bed where once queens had lain was stripped of comfort, the curtains torn, the fire dim. In the stillness of night, he prayed, not for rescue, but for righteousness. He believed his trial a sin against heaven itself. For how could man judge one chosen by God? Yet beneath that conviction burned a quiet dread that perhaps heaven, too, had turned its face away. The trial began in Westminster Hall, a chamber built for coronations and triumphs, now repurposed for ruin. Over 130 commissioners summoned to judge their king, yet many refused, trembling at the thought of divine retribution. When Charles entered, the air seemed to stop. He wore black, the color of mourning, trimmed with silver lace, a white satin vest beneath, symbol of purity, gleaming against the gloom. He carried himself not as a captive, but as a martyr already crowned. "By what power," he demanded, "do you judge your king?" The silence that followed was colder than steel. No answer was given, for the question itself was heresy, a challenge to the New England being born from rebellion's flame. Outside, London watched. Pamphlets spread through the city like wildfire, some calling him tyrant, others saint. Preachers thundered from pulpits that justice must be done. But in taverns and alleyways, men whispered that the world was turning upside down. Charles spoke little, yet every word was weighed like scripture. He refused to plead. He refused to bow. He refused to acknowledge the court's right to exist. His composure unnerved them, a king unbroken by humiliation. Even his enemies began to fear him again, for in his silence, they saw the shadow of monarchy's ghost, a power they could kill, but never entirely destroy. The verdict was inevitable. Charles Stuart, guilty of high treason against the realm of England, a king, accused by his subjects, condemned by his own parliament. It was a sentence that tore the soul of the nation in two. Outside Westminster, a snowstorm began to fall. Some said it was heaven weeping, others the chill of divine anger. Charles received the news with calm resolve. He requested 2 shirts for the day of execution, for he feared that if he shivered from cold, the crowd might think he trembled from fear. Even in death, he would not appear weak. January 30th, 1649. The city awoke to silence. Drums rolled through the streets as soldiers cleared the way. Windows were shuttered, prayers whispered behind closed doors. At St. James's Palace, the king knelt for the last time. He received Holy Communion, his voice steady, his gaze serene. To his loyal attendants, he said, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." He wore black breeches, a white vest, and a cloak of thick cloth to keep the cold from showing. He walked with quiet dignity through Whitehall, past the very walls where he had ruled, judged, and prayed. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house, the same palace where Rubens had painted his ceiling of divine kingship. Above, cherubs and angels celebrated the power of monarchy. Below, that power came to its end. Charles stepped forward, calm as winter stone. The executioner wore black, his face hidden behind a mask. The king addressed the crowd, not to plead, but to testify. "I die a faithful man," he declared, "and a true Christian to the last." He forgave his enemies. He prayed for England. He placed his head upon the block and whispered, "Remember." The blade fell. The nation gasped, and for a moment, even time seemed to hold its breath. The executioner lifted the severed head for the crowd to see. A groan of grief and disbelief rippled through the multitude. Some dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood. Others turned away, unable to watch. It was not merely the death of a man. It was the death of a divine idea. Across England, churches fell into uneasy quiet. Prayers for the king became whispers of martyrdom. Paintings of his face appeared in secret. And in that silence, monarchy became myth. The crown transformed into a ghost that would haunt England forever. The execution of Charles I was more than an act of rebellion. It was the birth of a new world, forged in moral terror. For the first time, a monarch was held accountable to his people, but at a cost too great for any to celebrate. The sword of justice had cut through the veil of heaven, and though the crown had fallen, its shadow remained, lingering in every heart that feared the judgment of men and the silence of God. Charles had ruled as if chosen by divine right. He died as if certain of divine redemption. And between those two beliefs, England tore itself apart. The axe had fallen, but the echo lingered. It rolled through the streets of London, through the cathedrals and markets, through the chambers of Parliament and the whispers of prayer. The king was dead, and yet his shadow remained. England was adrift. A republic had been proclaimed, but few knew what freedom truly meant, and fewer still understood the cost. The divine order, that sacred bridge between heaven and crown, had been severed. And as the blood of Charles I seeped into the frozen boards of Whitehall, it became more than mortal blood. It became legend. Almost as soon as the blade fell, myth began to rise. Royalists in secret called him St. Charles the Martyr. His blood was said to cure illness. His image was painted like that of a saint. Portraits showed him serene, angelic, his eyes lifted heavenward as though already ascending. The parliamentarians had wanted to destroy monarchy. Instead, they created a martyr. For those who still believed in kingship, his death was not defeat, but redemption, the final proof that a king's power was not of this earth, but of heaven, beyond the reach of mortal judgment. Far from home, Queen Henrietta Maria lived as a ghost among foreign courts. France offered her refuge, but not comfort. Each letter she received from England carried both hope and heartbreak, news of loyalists still resisting, of royalist uprisings in Scotland, of the prince she had left behind, now hunted, now hidden. Every night she prayed before a small crucifix, and every night she whispered her husband's last words. Remember. To her, he was no longer just Charles the husband, but Charles the Holy Sacrifice, a martyr whose blood would one day wash England clean of rebellion. The prince had fled, pursued by Cromwell's forces through Scotland, across moors and mountains, through the rain-soaked fields of Britain's broken heart. He watched his father's world crumble, but from those ashes, he learned the patience of survival. For nearly a decade, he wandered Europe in exile, from the Dutch ports to the palaces of France, learning to charm, to flatter, to wait. And all the while, the image of his father's death haunted him. Every oath, every alliance, every deception he would one day make was shadowed by that memory. The crown once stained by blood, the throne that must be won back not by divine right, but by human cunning. The regicide had not brought peace. Oliver Cromwell now ruled in the name of the Commonwealth, but his England was no kingdom of joy. The theaters were closed, the bells were silenced. Laughter itself was deemed a sin. The people who had risen to slay a tyrant found themselves under a sterner master, a republic ruled by fear, prayer, and iron. And yet, beneath the silence, whispers grew. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand spoke of the slain king's holiness, of miracles at his tomb, of visions in the night where Charles appeared crowned in light. The New England had killed the body, but not the spirit. In hidden chambers across England, loyalists gathered. They toasted the king over the water, the prince in exile, and swore oaths over goblets of wine and tears. They read his father's final speech in whispers, passing it like contraband scripture. Every tavern held a ghost, every chapel a prayer for vengeance. And the more Cromwell tried to stamp out the memory, the more sacred that memory became. When the Commonwealth began to crumble, when soldiers mutinied and Parliament fell to quarrel, the tide turned once more toward monarchy. The exiled prince, now Charles II, was summoned home. He stepped onto English soil, the same ground his father's blood had consecrated. Crowds wept, cheered, and knelt as if witnessing resurrection itself. From the ruins of rebellion rose renewal, and from the death of Charles I came the rebirth of kingship. But even as he smiled, even as trumpets sounded and flags unfurled, Charles II knew the truth. His crown gleamed not with divine light, but with his father's shadow. Every January 30th, England remembered. Church bells tolled for the fallen king. Sermons declared him the blessed martyr. Poets compared him to Christ, betrayed, condemned, and slain by his own people. The state that had once beheaded its sovereign now wept at his shrine. His image, once hated, now hung in churches. His words were carved into marble, his prayers set to music. The monarchy, restored, was stronger than ever, not because of power, but because of faith in its endurance through suffering. Even centuries later, the shadow of Charles I remains. His death was more than a moment. It was a mirror, a reflection of power, faith, and human frailty. To some, he was a tyrant, a man who clung to divine right while his people cried for freedom. To others, he was a saint, a king who stood firm when all else crumbled. But to history, he is something greater, a symbol of the eternal struggle between authority and conscience, between the crown and the crowd, between heaven's law and man's. And that struggle, born in blood and faith, still whispers through the heart of every kingdom that dares to call itself free. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall. But in Westminster, in Windsor, in Whitehall, the spirit of that cold January morning lingers, for though Charles Stuart lost his head, he gained what no monarch before him had ever won: immortality in memory. His execution made him eternal. His fall gave rise to faith. His silence at the scaffold became the voice of kingship forever. And as the candle flickers and the crown glimmers faintly in its light, one truth remains unshaken through time. A king may die, but the idea of kingship never truly perishes. After the fall of Charles I, England found itself adrift. The divine order had been severed. The crown lay silent, its weight now replaced by parchment and will, the rule of men rather than the rule of kings. Oliver Cromwell rose from the ranks of the faithful, a soldier of iron discipline and austere conviction. He promised to cleanse England, to free her from the corruption of tyranny and idolatry. But in the echoing halls of Parliament, beneath banners of liberty and God's will, another throne was quietly built, invisible yet absolute. The Commonwealth became not the dawn of freedom, but the long twilight of control. Church bells rang under curfew, laughter was silenced in the taverns, and the theaters, once alive with Shakespeare's words, were shuttered beneath Puritan decree. Faith became a weapon, and conscience a cage. Still, beneath this grey England, embers stirred. In dark cellars and silent chapels, men and women whispered the forbidden name: Charles Rex. Paintings of the martyred king were hidden beneath floorboards. His image burned not in scorn, but in sanctity. They called him St. Charles the Martyr. His blood, they believed, had redeemed the monarchy, just as Christ had redeemed mankind. His execution had not ended kingship, it had anointed it with divine suffering. And so, while Cromwell ruled with iron and fire, the ghost of the king walked beside him. No law, no sermon, no army could banish the idea of divine right, for it had become something stronger than rule. It had become faith. When Cromwell died in 1658, England exhaled, weary, hollow, uncertain. And in that silence, a ship crossed the channel. Upon its deck stood the son of a slain king, Charles II, the living echo of England's conscience. The crown that had fallen at Whitehall was rising once more. When the axe fell at Whitehall in 1649, it did not merely sever a man from his life, it cleaved a nation from its soul. The blood of Charles I had consecrated the idea of monarchy in the English mind, turning rebellion into sin and kingship into sanctity. For more than a decade, England wandered through its grey experiment, a realm without a crown, a people without ceremony. Church bells rang not for kings but for soldiers. The theaters stood silent. Music itself seemed ashamed to breathe. But ghosts do not rest so easily. In the years after Cromwell's death, England began to dream again. Dreams of processions, coronations, and the soft glow of pageantry that once wrapped her in divine grandeur. The Commonwealth had preached equality, yet birthed exhaustion. The people longed for beauty, for reverence, for something to believe in. And so, in May of 1660, a ship sailed across the channel. Aboard stood Charles II, son of the executed king, carrying in his heart both his father's memory and the nation's hunger for renewal. The same sky that had once thundered over regicide now broke into sunlight. As the ship neared Dover, crowds lined the cliffs. Bells rang from every spire. It was not only a royal return, it was an act of resurrection. The monarchy, once buried beneath the scaffold's boards, was rising from the tomb of history. But the ghost of Charles I walked with his son. Every act of the restored court, every oath, every feast, every coronation hymn, carried the echo of the man who had died for his crown. The divine right of kings was no longer merely a doctrine. It had become a legend, sanctified by suffering, sealed in blood. In Westminster Abbey, they sang his name as a martyr. In paintings, he wore the halo of saints. And though Charles II danced in the glitter of the Restoration, England never forgot the silence of that January morning, when the axe fell and heaven wept. The ghost of the beheaded king did not vanish with time. He remained, not in body, but in ritual, in crown, in prayer. Every monarch after him would feel his presence, and every throne in Britain would stand not only upon stone, but upon sacrifice. Charles I was gone, yet through the centuries his shadow lingers, whispering through the corridors of power, that kings may fall, but the crown endures.
Subscribe for more untold history.